So that is the part that you rarely hear about. So I recommend people go and read that entire speech so that we get a better understanding of the South African condition, the South African struggle, and Nelson Mandela himself. Now, the Portuguese colonies in Africa, all of the Portuguese colonies had to take up arms and to fight for their independence. Mozambique, Angola, Guinea. And you know, Portugal was ruled for a long time by the dictator Salazar from the 1930s all the way to 1968. And the armed resistance started in the 1960s and lasted until 1974. Portugal was backed by NATO, was a NATO member, used napalm, very vicious tactics, including wiping out, massacring entire villages in its African colonies. But ultimately, all of those colonies won their independence in Mozambique, led by Frelimo. The Portuguese assassinated the first leader of Frelimo, Eduardo Mondlane, and he was succeeded by Samora Machel, who saw the battle till the end until they won independence in 1975. In Angola, the struggle was led by the MPLA, and there were two other parties, UNITA and the FNLA. UNITA was led by Jonas Savimbi, FNLA by Holden Robato, both backed by the West and by the Central Intelligence Agency. The MPLA backed by the Eastern countries and by Cuba. When there was a power struggle at the time they were to win independence in 1975, the CIA and the West backed the UNITA and the FNLA, and Cuba actually sent thousands of troops to fight with the MPLA, and that's how the MPLA managed to secure victory and form the first government post-colonialism in Angola. And in Guinea-Bissau, the fight was led by the party called the PAIGC, and its leader was Amilcar Cabral. Cabral famously said, "We are actually not military people. We are armed militants." That's one of his famous quotes. And after this war of liberation, people are going to go back to their professions, whether they're teachers, whether they're farmers. He was one of the amazing intellectuals on the African continent. Unfortunately, he was assassinated also by people working for the Portuguese secret police in 1973. He was killed a year before independence in 1974, when Guinea-Bissau also became independent. And then in terms of Angola's role in the liberation of Namibia and South Africa, Cuba was also involved in that. So in the 1980s, the UNITA had become empowered again, was strong enough to militarily threaten the MPLA government in Angola, and it had South African support, and South Africa actually invaded parts of Angola from Namibia. At that time, South Africa controlled what is today Namibia and called it Southwest Africa. It had captured it after Germany was defeated in World War I. So it had been ruling Namibia since 1915, and from there invaded into Angola and was threatening the government. So Cuba, under Castro, sent tens of thousands of soldiers, fought alongside the MPLA, defeated Savimbi and UNITA, and defeated the South African invasion force. And when South Africa realized that it could actually lose militarily to a non-European army, it vacated Namibia, and Namibia became independent in 1990. South Africa also released Nelson Mandela in 1990, and in 1994, the ANC won the first democratic elections, and Nelson Mandela became president of South Africa. Portugal, the last to leave, had to be kicked out of Africa, having been the first Portugal had been in Africa 500 years, the longest European colonial empire. And of course, Portugal is also one of the poorest countries in Europe, and that's why it wanted to hold on essentially forever to its African empire. And then we have in what was Rhodesia and is now Zimbabwe, where Britain essentially allowed the Europeans to pull off a scam there. And there the situation was very similar to Kenya, where the European minority owned essentially most of the fertile land, and the Africans were reserved into the most arid parts of the country. And the Africans eventually had to take up arms because the Europeans in what was then Rhodesia declared what they called unilateral declaration of independence and formed a white administration, something that Britain could have, of course, suppressed within a matter of days. But then it would have meant that the replacement would have to be an African government. And Britain wasn't interested in that. And that's why that was the declaration was made by Ian Smith, who became the white prime minister in what was then Rhodesia. And the guerrilla armies that emerged were led by Joshua Nkomo and his party, which was called ZAPU, Zimbabwe African People's Union, and by Robert Mugabe, and his party was ZANU, Zimbabwe African National Union. Eventually, they teamed up to coordinate their military strategies and their fight under the ban of the Patriotic Front. And they were supported by some of the African countries that had already become independent by that time. They were supported by countries like Tanzania, countries like Zambia, countries like Mozambique that had won its own independence a few years earlier. And ultimately, they succeeded in defeating the Ian Smith regime, and the British at the last minute interceded in 1980 to organize elections so that there would not be an outright military defeat of the white minority government on the battlefield, because then, of course, you would not have any control of the negotiations. And some parts of that negotiations is the reason why Zimbabwe is now experiencing some hardships. And we might discuss that in the next episode when we focus more on neo-colonialism in Africa. So these were the countries that had to pick up arms. In many cases, the independence was negotiated. As in Ghana, it started with the uprisings, yes, but ultimately they negotiated in the post-colonial arrangement. Countries like Uganda, countries like what was Tanganyika under Julius Nyerere, a great African intellectual and statesman as well, whose works I strongly recommend that people read. And then Tanganyika, of course, united with the island of Zanzibar and created what is now Tanzania. I want to also discuss Congo. Congo has a very tragic history, but Congo's history is also a good segue into neocolonialism and Africa. So I won't discuss Congo in episode number 13. I will save that for episode number 14 when I discuss neocolonialism in Africa, and you'll see how it really eases us in. And for the Cuban assistance to Angola, to Namibia, and to South Africa by the defeat of the South African army, that battle that was called the Battle of Cuito Cuanavale, Cuanavale. So you can do additional research if you're interested in that battle. And there are a few documentaries about that on YouTube as well. So I will save also discussion of Lumumba and Congo for the next episode. So this brings us to an end to episode number 13. Episode number 14, we'll ask the question, has independence really led to independence in Africa? That is the question that we will explore. Episode number 14. My suggested references for episode number 13 is General History of Africa, volume number 8, Africa since 1935. The editor is Ali Mazrui, Mazrui. The second is Return to the Source, Selected Speeches of Amilcar Cabral. His last name is Cabral, and it's by the African Information Service. And then I also recommend Nelson Mandela, Full Speech at Rivonia Trial, April 20, 1964. That is also available on YouTube, or you could also Google that. I also recommend The Battle of Algiers, which is a dramatization of the Battle of Algiers. It's part of the War of Algerian National Independence. And that was made in 1966 by Gillo Pontecorvo. So it's Gillo, Gillo. The last name is Pontecorco. I also recommend Secret History, Mau Mau, 1999. And Mau Mau, that despicable British concoction, is spelled M-A-U, and then a second word, M-A-U. And that was made by Channel 4 in the United Kingdom. And then finally, Cuba, Africa, Revolution. And that's a documentary by Jihan El Tahiri. First name is Jihan. The last name is El-Tahri. And that was first released in 2007. And then it also came out by the BBC. So that brings us to the end of episode number 13. Thank you so much, comrades. Stay well, stay healthy. I will see you next week with episode number 14. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi.